Tengo el placer, y es de los pocos placeres que una presidencia le puede dar a uno, de presentar a los profesores de la talla que van a participar ahora. Hemos visto profesores geniales a lo largo de este congreso, pero quiero remarcar el esfuerzo tan enorme que la Fundación Charcot ha hecho en este Congreso mexicano, dado que los doctores salieron uno ayer de Milán y la doctora Leocani llegó hoy. Aterrizó su avión a las 4 de la mañana, por lo que quiero que por favor les brinden un muy fuerte aplauso, como decíamos a la mexicana, que se oiga bien fuerte, por favor. El doctor Giancarlo Comi no necesita ninguna presentación. De todas maneras, está ahí una parte pequeñísima de lo que es su labor alrededor de todo el mundo, sus premios, sus publicaciones, sus participaciones académicas, formadoras, en otras fundaciones, con iniciativas que llenan la existencia de las personas con esclerosis múltiple, lo mismo de conocimientos alrededor del mundo, y no le voy a robar ni un segundo más porque el doctor Comi es el chairman de este simposio. Very welcome.
Okay, so, sorry. One of the classical and major problem is to try to dissect which are the mechanisms that are operating in the different phases of the disease. This very famous slide suggests that we have two major phases in the disease, the progressive phase of the disease and the relapsing phase of the disease. So the relapsing phase of the disease in red is driven by dysfunction at the periphery of the immune system. Vice versa, the central, the chronic phase of the disease is driven by what happened inside the central nervous system. And on the left, you see there is a green area, and the green area is very important because, as we have heard even yesterday, the age has a lot of role in the accumulation of disability, both because of the immunosenescence and the presence of a lot of comorbidities that unfortunately they increase with age. So if we look at this screen, it seems that we have a clear separation between the relapsing phase and the progressive phase. Unfortunately, this is not really true. One of the reasons why such a clear separation is not possible is because the mechanisms that are driving the accumulation of irreversible disability in the progressive phase of the disease are quite variable. Here in this very perfect review by Daniel Montaneda, it has been listed a series of different types of mechanisms that contribute. And these mechanisms, they play a role at a different time in the evolution of the disease. They overlap partially. So we don't have just one way to accumulate disability progression from the pathophysiological mechanism. We have many different types of mechanisms. So then the key point became, when does the mechanism of progression becoming prevalent compared to the mechanism of accumulation of disability due to attacks and new lesions? In the classical view, we have here the line that describes the point of separation between the relapsing and the progressive phase. However, some new data do suggest that probably this line is not correct. We have to consider that at least some of these mechanisms can be active since the beginning, the biological beginning of the disease. Please pay attention. The fact that this mechanism could be very active since the beginning of the disease doesn't mean that the accumulation of irreversible disabilities then since the beginning of the disease and there is no possibility to halt this type of mechanisms. Of course, there are a lot of methodological aspects that prevent our ability to pick up as early as possible the presence of this type of mechanism and what we define as secondary progressive phase or a primary progressive phase of the disease. Always is a retrospective classification, and sometimes at the time we classify the patient as entered in the progressive phase, we realize that probably this type of definition and shift could be updated by many years before. Why it is so relevant, this discussion? Because, of course, as soon as new drugs will be available, able to target this mechanism in a very specific way, then we need to know when we have to start to use this type of drugs, perhaps in combination with the classical anti-inflammatory drugs. Two really important papers have highlighted the possibility that the onset of progression has to be anticipated by many years in the history of a person with MS. The first paper was a paper from the UCSF group, and this paper was the one responsible of the definition of silent progression. And the second paper is a paper by Ludwig Kappos promoting the concept of PIRA. So the first paper was, I think, very interesting because essentially what they did, they looked longitudinally for more than 10 years to the evolution of the disease using the brain MRI atrophy as a measure of the accumulation of irreversible tissue damage. And they saw that also in patients without any new lesion in the brain during these 10 years, that is the line in violet, accumulated some progressive brain atrophy in absence then from any type of clinical or MRI disease activity. And they interpret that as an evidence that the silent progression is in some way telling us about the early onset of the phenomenon of progression. There is only a problem here. The problem is that the average disease duration in patients followed for these 10 years was more than 10 years. So it was not focused on the early phase of the disease, it was already focused in the intermediate phase of the disease. And we know that in the intermediate phase of the disease, the risk to conversion to secondary progressive MS is very high. We already know since a very long time that the role of relapses in accumulation of disability decrease progressively during the evolution of the disease. So the very first attacks have a very important role in predicting disability and also in predicting the onset of secondary progressive MS. That is just what you can see here in the box in the inferior part. And with the evolution of the disease, the single attacks has more and more or less value or less role in predicting the accumulation of disability. The second paper, I said, is the paper by Ludwig Kappos. It is so well known, the concept of PIRA, that I don't want to lose too much time about this point again. However, we should really consider that the PIRA as it has been defined by Ludwig Kappos, has a lot of problems because there are many different factors that I try to summarize here that may really influence this type of definition. And particularly, it is clear now that we have accumulated a lot of papers about PIRA, that PIRA may be persistent or may be reversible. And it is clear that a reversible PIRA cannot be considered like at the time where the patient entered the progressive phase of the disease. Second, it depends the way we assess this evolution independent from attacks. In the paper of Kappos, the definition was based on a composite score, and the composite score has a great value because it enhances our ability to pick up a longitudinal change, but from the other side, it has also the problem of a very low specificity because the more measures you use, the more you have a risk to be wrong in your definition. Second and very important point is that only a sustained PIRA may really reveal the presence of a disease that is evolving. And so if you have a sustained PIRA, then you may really think that you are in some way already detecting the onset of progression. But it is unsustained, reversible. It is much more probably an undetected attack or if you like, a subclinical MRI activity. And this is absolutely true because in this paper by Fred Lablin, where a very large number of patients have been observed, both patients coming from clinical trials and from observational studies, it was clear that if we use the definition of PIRA restricted to patients with a sustained PIRA, a PIRA that is present also at the end of the observation, the proportion of patients with relapsing remitting showing a PIRA sustained is of the order of 3-4%. So it means that not all PIRA, not all relapsing patients have already evidence of irreversible disability accumulations since the beginning. And a second very important epidemiological study from the Italian registry, using more than 16,000 patients, followed for more than 11 years, confirm that this is absolutely true. And this study demonstrated that you have, let's say, about half of the relapsing remitting patients followed for this long period with evidence of a confirmed disability accumulation, and that the large proportion of these patients had the disability accumulation because of PIRA condition, but only 27% of patients with PIRA transition to secondary progressive MS, and those who transition were mostly patients with 2 or more episodes of confirmed and sustained PIRA. So the message here is one PIRA is really not revealing so much the entering the progressive phase of the disease. A second major point was the fact that in order to have a very accurate definition of PIRA, you must use in parallel also the evaluation of MRI, because a true PIRA is a PIRA which is not associated at the same time with the presence of MRI activity. A PIRA with MRI activity is a PIRA where the examiner failed to detect something that was clearly there due to a new activity of the disease. And this other Italian study based on the Italian registry, where this type of analysis was combining together both the evaluation of clinical and MRI activity, reveal again that the majority of patients with accumulation entering the progressive phase of the disease and accumulating disability independent from attacks were patients with presence of some MRI activity. So the true PIRA, again, is a minority of the PIRA process. And this other study from the group of Fred Lablin again demonstrated that what has been seen by our study was absolutely true. You see here different colors. The colors at the top is the dark violet color, is representing in the group of patients with PIRA, which is the proportion of patients with a true PIRA, so a PIRA which is not linked to any MRI activity. As you can see, the proportion is very small. So then someone may see the PIRA concept like a misleading concept. However, it is clear that when we see a PIRA early in the disease course, like in this study of the Xavier Montalvan Center, then this type of event, which is not frequent, is in any case an event that is strongly associated with a very high risk of a future conversion to a secondary progressive MS and an accumulation of severe disability. I think this is very clear, as you can see here. So I think that the conclusion is here that, of course, we have to consider that we may clearly anticipate the time the patient start to have a quite clear relevant role of a mechanism of accumulation of disability, which are expression of the phenomenon of progression. However, this type of information has to be used in a very appropriate way, and particularly don't confuse a peer event with a classification of a person with progressive MS. So I will be quite short in the second part of my talk, because if it is really fundamental to anticipate our ability to pick up the progression, unfortunately, at present, even if we are able to reveal very early such a phenomenon, we miss, unfortunately, treatments that are really able to target quite efficiently this type of phenomenon. Again, the aim of intervene in patients with progressive MS today is first to try to take advantage from the two approved drugs we have, and second, to try to use these drugs in the most appropriate way. Which are the drugs that we have here? Well, the drugs are, as you know, the siponimod for secondary progressive MS and the ocrelizumab for primary progressive MS. Of course, this is what happened, I think, here, is what happened in Europe. In North America, a list of other drugs are approved for treatment of progressive MS, provided that it is a progressive MS with attacks. That is the so-called active progressive MS. If we look to what we have seen with the observational studies, it is clear that all these drugs that were listed at the top, interferons and some S1P modulator, this drug, when used very early, they may have some advantage also in progressive MS, but the advantage is mostly in reducing the risk of overlap of attacks. Very little effects, as you can see in the bottom, in terms of ability to protect from the accumulation of disability. I think this study compare what we define today the highly active treatments against the modest active treatment in secondary progressive MS, and you can see that the two curves overlap completely. So there was this type of comparison revealed that there was no advantage from the high efficacy treatment, with some exception, because for monoclonal antibody, rituximab, this Swedish study showed that, well, if you have a very, very active treatment, then even in secondary progressive MS, you may have some results. So then the question is, all the patients with secondary progressive MS may have such a benefit? Well, not true, because even if we look at the results of clinical trials, this is the Cipollimo study, in the subgroup analysis post hoc, it was clear that the benefit was there only for some subpopulation of patients, and particularly those with evidence of clinical or MRI activity at the study entry, and those who were younger, less disabled at the time of treatment onset, and with a shorter disease duration. And this is really a fundamental message, because also in the trial in primary progressive MS, ocrelizumab revealed to be more effective in those patients with still some persisting clinical and MRI activity. Again, I think a very fundamental message. So what we have today may still have some impact on the early phase of primary or secondary progressive. However, desperately, we need something more. And of course, we have to fit a lot and to deal with a lot of problems in terms of the future availability of really neuroprotective drugs. I think that this cartoon shows you a bit the complexity and how many different tentatives are there in order to be able to have a new treatment that really target progression. We have no time to go in details, but I want just to show you a couple of possibilities. One is masitinib. I think this is an interesting drug because already in ALS, in a study I was involved, there was some evidence of the ability of this drug that target microglia to slow down the process of accumulation of disability. And a phase 2, I have to say, a small study revealed that masitinib was able to reduce the accumulation of disability in a 2-year study. There is now a couple of ongoing clinical trials in progressive MS. Let's see what happens. And the second is the story of the BTK inhibitors. We have already heard a lot, even in this meeting, about this, so I will be very fast. The value of this is really the fact that it targets the B cells without destroying B cells, just modulating the activity of B cells, which has, of course, from the theoretical point of view, a lot of advantages on the long-term use of this drug. And second, because of the intense activity on the myeloid cells, macrophages, macrophages, microglia, there is the possibility that the inflammatory activity in the CNS, which is clearly persisting during the chronic phase of the disease, may be turned down quite clearly, and such an effect may also allow a better enhancement of remyelination. Professor Hartung will touch more in detail this problem. So this could be a very interesting possibility. There are a lot of different drugs that are active here. They have a different profile of off-target effects, so probably a different profile in terms of safety, but also a different penetration of the central nervous system, so a different possibility to interact at the central nervous system level. Fenebrutinib is a very interesting BTK inhibitor for many reasons, and a trial is now started in patients with primary progressive MS. Is extremely difficult trial because it's a head-to-head trial with ocrelizumab. So I think not easy trial, but is really what we need from the scientific point of view. And a couple of trials on progressive MS, primary and secondary, are also ongoing with tolebrutinib. There were some safety problems, but the trials are now restarted. And I will not talk about remyelination. And the very last slide is this one. Of course, at the extreme, we have also to consider cellular therapy. The study we performed in San Raffaele in testing the efficacy of neural stem cells with some clear evidence that there were some biological modification due to the administration of neural stem cells intrathecally, may also open the door to some other possibility. So my conclusion then is that here, unfortunately, there is only little we can do today for patients with progressive MS. However, something can be done. We really have to use available treatments, and here siponimod and ocrelizumab, but also other B cells, monoclonal anti-B cells therapy have to be used. I think that the Swedish trial, for me, it was very convincing, showing that if you use this type of intervention in the early progressive phase of the disease, in young persons with a shorter phase of progression, we may still think to have some good results. Of course, we have to look at the future in order to try to have something that, when available, we will combine with the traditional anti-inflammatory therapies, because I think that the combination therapy where we target both central and peripheral mechanism of tissue damage are really fundamental. Thank you so much for your attention. The second speaker is Professor Daniel Ontaneda. Daniel will address one of the really fundamental points, that is the availability of good tools, both for clinical trials and clinical practice, in order to monitor disease evolution in progressive MS, MRI to assess progression and recovery. Daniel, thank you so much.
All right, I would like to start by thanking the European Charcot Foundation and Professor Comey for the kind invitation and introduction to present. So today, cambio al español, voy a hablar sobre resonancia magnética como una metodología para medir la progresión y también la recuperación. Esto es un tema bastante amplio y creo que lo que voy a hacer es elegir algunos de los marcadores de resonancia magnética que creo que son más útiles y tal vez van a estar a la vanguardia, tanto en el cuidado clínico de los pacientes como en los ensayos clínicos controlados. Estas son mis divulgaciones, que no tienen mayor relevancia con el contenido. Yo soy un gran fan de la resonancia magnética. Es el biomarcador, como les dije ayer, más utilizado en la esclerosis múltiple. Forma realmente la base de los criterios diagnósticos de la enfermedad y también funciona como un marcador de pronóstico y también puede utilizarse como una herramienta para medir la respuesta terapéutica a los fármacos que utilizamos. Y esto es lo que sabemos en esclerosis múltiple remitente recurrente, que es un Esto es un estudio que lo publicó María Pia Sormani, que básicamente es un metaanálisis de varios ensayos clínicos controlados en esclerosis múltiple remitente recurrente, que lo que nos enseñaron es que si uno mide una respuesta en resonancia en relación a nuevas lesiones, uno tiene un efecto muy claro en recaídas. Y por lo tanto podemos utilizar resonancia como un biomarcador de respuesta de una manera clínica. Ahora, la pregunta es, hoy no estamos hablando de esclerosis múltiple remitente recurrente, estamos hablando de esclerosis múltiple progresiva. Y la pregunta es, nosotros tenemos tal vez algún tipo de método que podemos utilizar en la resonancia para predecir un cambio clínico en la esclerosis múltiple progresiva. Entonces, como les dije, varias medidas se pueden utilizar y creo que esto es un tema que depende a uno a quien pregunte cuál va a ser la respuesta. Pero yo les voy a hablar sobre los marcadores que yo creo que están más prontos a ser utilizados en el esquema clínico. Uno son las medidas de atrofia del cerebro. Segundo, voy a hablar sobre la imagenología de las lesiones activas crónicas, que creemos que es uno de los procesos que realmente está fomentando la progresión en los pacientes con esclerosis múltiple. Y después también hablar sobre algunas herramientas de resonancia que nos pueden ayudar a imaginar cómo puede darse la reparación del tejido neural. Entonces, empecemos con medidas de atrofia. Este es un video que tenemos de un paciente que fue seguido en Cleveland Clinic desde el año 2000 hasta el 2014, entonces 14 años. Y ustedes pueden ver, lo que quiero que se fijen en esta diapositiva, es cómo hay una pérdida progresiva de atrofia, tanto cortical como central en los ventrículos. Y en la figura de abajo ustedes pueden ver cómo ese paciente va a ir acumulando EDSS a través del tiempo. Es de la barra azul este paciente que les estoy mostrando en este momento. Y entonces, por supuesto, la atrofia cerebral lógicamente va a ser un predictor de la discapacidad. En vez de hablar de estudios individuales, creo que vale la pena este estudio hecho por Paul Matthews, publicado en el año 2023. Empezaron con 1,610 estudios publicados que están relacionando los niveles de atrofia de diferentes compartimientos del cerebro. A la final eligieron 50 de estos marcadores y encontraron cuáles son los que predicen una discapacidad con esclerosis múltiple. Y todos los cuadros que están en verde indican los que tuvieran una relación consistente con discapacidad. Esto incluye atrofia cerebral completa, volumen ventricular, el volumen del tejido encefálico gris, también el volumen o el área del cuerpo calloso. Entonces yo creo que si es que nos tenemos que enfocar en medidas de progresión, seguramente van a ser estos 4 lo más importantes. Relaciones inconsistentes con sistema límbico, no se encontraron asociaciones, esto es una cosa que lo sabemos, con la cantidad de tejido blanco. Por lo tanto, pensamos a la esclerosis múltiple como una enfermedad de sustancia blanca y sustancia gris, pero tal vez a largo plazo para atrofia lo que más nos interesa es la sustancia gris. Y también, si volvemos a ver los estudios de María Pia Sormani, vemos si es que uno añade atrofia a la predicción de discapacidad, esto es en remitente recurrente, uno igual puede encontrar un efecto. Y si uno combina no solo atrofia, sino lesiones más atrofia, se pueden dar cuenta, como el R cuadrado, que es la cantidad de variación que explica el modelo, va aumentando de 0.48 para atrofia sola, 0.61 para lesión sola y 0.75 para atrofia y para lesión. Por lo tanto, sabemos que esta es una medida que nos va a permitir pensar en la atrofia. Quería hacer un hincapié en este estudio, que fue un estudio fase 2 de un medicamento que se llama Ibudilast, que lo hicimos en la Cleveland Clinic. Esto lo publicamos en el New England Journal of Medicine en el año 2018. Y como ustedes pueden ver, este es un medicamento que tuvo una reducción importante del volumen cerebral en pacientes con esclerosis múltiple secundaria progresiva y esclerosis múltiple primaria progresiva. En el cuadro que a ustedes les va a quedar a la derecha, también pueden ver cómo este cambio de parénquima cerebral se da a través de las diferentes semanas entre el placebo y el medicamento Ibudilast. Entonces, a través de las 96 semanas del estudio se ve una disminución importante. Entonces, uno pudiera ver esta diapositiva y decir, perfecto,
Este medicamento realmente reduce atrofia y típicamente cuando vemos atrofia vemos estas líneas muy claras entre las dos. Pero como yo tengo un poco de acceso a este estudio, sabemos cómo son los datos detrás de ese estudio, que nos indican que a pesar de que nosotros a nivel poblacional podamos saber que hay un nivel de pérdida de volumen cerebral, la verdad es que hay mucho movimiento entre un periodo y otro periodo y hay mucha variabilidad. Ustedes pueden ver algunos pacientes aumentan volumen cerebral, algunos pacientes disminuyen volumen cerebral y lo pueden hacer como una forma de zigzag casi. Y entonces utilizar esta medida ya desde el punto de vista clínico puede resultar un poco más difícil. Una cosa que todos reconocemos importantemente es que la atrofia cerebral es importante, por supuesto, pero nosotros también debemos reconocer que la esclerosis múltiple progresiva, en su manifestación clínica, es una mielopatía crónica. La manifestación que nosotros vemos es principalmente de médula espinal. Y por lo tanto, ¿cómo no pensar que tal vez la atrofia de médula espinal va a influir aún más en la atrofia y en las mediciones de discapacidad de los pacientes con esclerosis múltiple secundariamente progresiva? Entonces les enseño dos estudios, uno de Mocha del grupo de UCL y otro del grupo de Barcelona, de Sastre Garriga. Estos dos estudios publicados en los últimos 4 años nos demuestran muy claramente que se puede hacer una medición en resonancia tanto de diferentes niveles en el estudio de Mocha, de los segmentos cervicales, cuando utilizamos una resonancia cervical específica, pero también lo podemos hacer utilizando una resonancia magnética que tenga cobertura que baje hasta la médula espinal. Y Jaume Sastre Garriga describió algo que él llama el volumen de reserva de médula espinal. Y esto lo que nos indica es cuánto del espacio del canal está ocupado. Es una manera de ajustar el volumen de la médula espinal. Y sabemos que estas medidas seguramente son medidas que vamos a empezar a utilizarlas en ensayos clínicos. Hoy por hoy realmente no hay muchos estudios longitudinales. A pesar de esto, lo que les demuestro en esta diapositiva es que claramente cuando uno hace un análisis de qué tantos pacientes uno necesitaría dependiendo de diferentes medidas, uno puede darse cuenta que incluso la atrofia de la médula espinal puede utilizarse básicamente como una medida para un ensayo clínico en esclerosis múltiple progresiva. Y se encuentra que en realidad el porcentaje de disminución de la médula espinal a través del tiempo tiene una desviación estándar algo baja y por lo tanto los números muestrales de disminución de volumen cerebral o de área cross-seccional de médula espinal puede ser una herramienta que podemos utilizar en los ensayos fase 2 en esclerosis múltiple progresiva. Voy a pasar a hablar un poco sobre las lesiones activas crónicas. Entonces ya hemos hablado sobre estas lesiones activas crónicas muchas veces. Esta es una diapositiva, cartoon de Bruce Trapp. Ustedes pueden ver que el A es el tejido normal, B es la lesión activa que tiene presencia de linfocitos agudos, monocitos, y C es lo que nosotros llamamos la lesión activa crónica, que tiene un core, un centro de área desmielizada y está rodeada de células MHC2 positivas que también tienden a tener tinciones positivas por hierro, que es lo que nosotros llamamos estas lesiones crónicamente activas. Y por último está la lesión en D, que es la lesión gliótica, que es una lesión crónica inactiva. Y entonces, claro, estas lesiones que les muestro en C, que son las lesiones crónicamente activas, creemos que son importantes para la esclerosis múltiple. Y esto lo sabemos por estudios patológicos que han demostrado que esas lesiones, que también se llaman smoldering en inglés, las que están en naranja, empiezan a aumentar a través del curso de la enfermedad, específicamente en esclerosis múltiple progresiva. Las lesiones pasan de un estadio agudo, cuando tienen la pérdida de mielina inicial, a lesiones crónicas inactivas que tienen nuevamente estas células MHC2 positivas que tienen hierro, que son microglías, que están en un anillo alrededor de la lesión y después pasan a ser lesiones silentes. ¿Y qué es lo importante de esto? Uno, les voy a mostrar en la diapositiva que les queda a su lado izquierdo, en el subpanel A, ustedes ven, esta es una tinción de mielina, que es PLP. Y lo que se puede ver es que dentro de los macrófagos, en estas lesiones crónicas activas, hay presencia de debris de mielina. El patólogo normalmente solo tiene una foto de un solo punto. El patólogo no puede seguir lesiones a través del tiempo. Pero el hecho de que nosotros encontremos detritus de mielina dentro de los macrófagos nos sugiere que estas lesiones son unas lesiones que expanden a través del tiempo. ¿Qué más tienen estas lesiones? Tienen claramente activación de la microglía en la periferia de las lesiones en una forma de anillo. Y esa microglía también va a estar positiva cuando uno hace una tinción de hierro. Y esto es lo que nos va a permitir, de una manera u otra, hacer imagenología de estas lesiones. Entonces, como sabemos que estas lesiones se expanden a través del tiempo, podemos hacer un análisis de lesiones crónicamente expansivas. Para hacer esto necesitamos por lo menos 3 puntos, o sea, tenemos que seguir a los pacientes a través del tiempo y determinar que las lesiones están creciendo. La otra metodología son los anillos paramagnéticos. La ventaja de los anillos paramagnéticos es que lo que ellos van a visualizar es el hierro que está en ese anillo de microglía alrededor de estas lesiones activas crónicas. La ventaja es que solo se tiene que hacer un estudio para poder encontrarlos. La desventaja es que no en todos los escáneres tenemos esa secuencia, pero eventualmente creemos que van a ser parte del criterio diagnóstico y van a ser un poco más utilizadas. Entonces, quería hablarles un poco sobre la metodología de los Slowly Expanding Lesions, o CELS en inglés. Y esto lo que utiliza son resonancias a repetición para determinar que las lesiones están básicamente haciéndose más grandes. Y hay que acordarse que esto no es lo mismo que lesiones que están con aumento en T2, porque son diferentes. Una, las lesiones tienen que evolucionar de una manera lenta. 2, las lesiones tienen que evolucionar de una manera concéntrica. Y para hacer esto utilizamos solo T1 y T2. ¿Cómo se hace esto? Este es el estudio de Elliott, que se publicó en MSJ en el 2019. Empezamos con la primera imagen, que básicamente es un T1 al principio del estudio, después hacemos un T1 al final del estudio, y después hacemos una deformación, una matriz de deformación de cada uno de los voxels, y esto después lo aplicamos a una estructura jacobiana de integración, que es lo que se ve en la imagen de colores, que nos indica cuáles son los voxels que están aumentando de tamaño y cuáles son los voxels que están disminuyendo de tamaño. Después en la figura F tomamos un mapa de lesiones y determinamos si las lesiones están aumentando en esos voxels o están disminuyendo. Y después hacemos un corte superior de expansión y un corte inferior de expansión. ¿Por qué? Porque estas son lesiones que son slowly expanding lesions. No pueden expandir de manera muy rápida. Tienen que hacerlo de forma lenta y por lo tanto hay un margen superior y un margen inferior para estas. Tal vez lo más fácil es de explicarlo. Entonces, como ustedes pueden ver en la primera imagen que ustedes tienen a su izquierda, esta es una lesión que tiene 3 puntos y está realmente constantemente aumentando de tamaño. Es una lesión crónicamente, lentamente expansiva. En cambio, en la parte inferior, en el B, ustedes pueden ver una lesión que realmente está al principio, demuestra algo de aumento de su tamaño, después disminuye y después más o menos se queda más o menos estable. Y por lo tanto, esa lesión no tiene una constancia. En el gráfico de colores lo que vemos en C es una lesión que está aumentándose de manera concéntrica alrededor de la parte central de la lesión, y eso sería una lesión slowly expanding, versus en el D es una lesión que solo está creciendo en un polo de la lesión, por lo tanto no la consideramos una slowly expanding lesion. La ventaja de los slowly expanding lesions es que tenemos muchos datos de resonancia que nos pueden dar, porque son de T1 y T2, y entonces todos los ensayos clínicos los podemos observar. Como ustedes pueden ver, en promedio los pacientes remitentes recurrentes tenían 4.6 lesiones, en oratorio, en pacientes primario progresivo 6.3, con un volumen muy superior, 1.800 milímetros cúbicos. Este es el estudio de Calvi y colaboradores, 135 pacientes, donde se demuestra que estos pacientes tienen un aumento de la progresión por cada aumento de volumen de cells. Ustedes pueden ver en verde son los pacientes que no tienen cells y en rojo y azul son los pacientes que tienen cell, y T1 nosotros creemos que es una medición de más o menos la densidad axonal de esas lesiones. El pronóstico, por supuesto, cuando nosotros vemos a cells, cuando hay presencia de 4 cells o más, el odds ratio para tener progresión de discapacidad a los 9 años es de 7.17, o sea, realmente alto. Y cuando lo rankeamos con otras medidas, más o menos aparece como el tercero más fuerte después del EDSS basal y después de MTR. También vemos que hay un efecto de tratamiento, ya escuchamos algo de los BTKI por el profesor Comey, y a pesar de que el estudio de evobrutinib fue un estudio negativo, realmente es interesante ver que hay una dosis de efecto de este medicamento sobre el número de lesiones que tienen cells, el volumen de cells. Y esto parece realmente biológico. También cuando vemos ocrelizumab en los pacientes primario progresivos, también hay un efecto de cells en comparación con placebo, sugiriendo que esto es una medida que tiene respuesta al tratamiento. Con Ibudilast vimos una cosa muy parecida. Esta es una publicación que hicimos en el 2023. Ibudilast aumenta el número de lesiones. En el estudio fase 2 aumentó el volumen lesional. Y claro, por eso se estudió en esclerosis múltiple progresiva, donde se creía que no tenía un efecto. Y como ustedes pueden ver aquí claramente, una reducción del 23 y el 21% en lesiones expansivas. ¿Qué son estas lesiones patológicamente? Bueno, hemos hecho algo de estudios de esto y encontramos que sí, en realidad, no son muchos los estudios, son pacientes de nuestra base de datos post-mortem, son pacientes que seguimos en vida, fueron a muerte y determinamos qué lesiones eran cells y después vimos estos cells bajo el microscopio y encontramos que sí, en realidad, de las 3 lesiones que vimos, 2 de las lesiones sí eran crónicamente activas. Esto es la patología que nos demuestra que estos cells tienen un anillo que tiene anillo de hierro y también tiene un anillo de células de la microglía. Después vamos a pasar a hablar sobre los anillos paramagnéticos. Los anillos paramagnéticos los definimos en este consenso de Names. Es una lesión que tiene por lo menos 2/3 partes de la lesión que tiene un aro que se colocaliza con una lesión T2 que tiene ausencia de reforzamiento con gadolinio. Lesiones pequeñas, lesiones concomitantes con venas o artefactos, no las contamos. Así es como se ven estas lesiones, como ustedes pueden ver en el estudio de fase, es un anillo básicamente de susceptibilidad que está dado por la presencia de hierro en el tejido y realmente esto es relativamente fácil una vez que uno se entrena para hacerlos. La prevalencia de estos es más o menos, en promedio, más o menos del 10%, creemos que es un poco mayor en pacientes progresivos y les voy a dar un poco de información en eso. Entonces, no todos los pacientes tienen estas lesiones PRL, pero cuando los pacientes lo tienen, también tenemos que acordarnos que estas no son lesiones fijas. Los estudios del NIH, de Danny Reich, nos indican en este ejemplo que estas lesiones desaparecen en un promedio de 7 años después de que están presentes. O sea, disminuye ese anillo paramagnético y el volumen de las lesiones también tiende a cambiar a través del tiempo. Pronóstico, nuevamente, los pacientes que tienen más de 4 lesiones con anillo paramagnético tienen un aumento de la discapacidad que se ve muy claramente, como ustedes pueden ver en el gráfico de ese lado. Y después ver en los pacientes que tienen PIRA. Los pacientes que tienen PIRA, comparando pacientes primarios progresivos con remitente recurrente, ustedes pueden ver el contagio de células PRL es mayor en pacientes que tienen PIRA, es mayor en pacientes con progresivo, también en ambos grupos. Pero, importantemente, parece que estos anillos paramagnéticos son más predictores de PIRA en pacientes progresivos. La coexistencia de estos dos marcadores es baja, la verdad. Solo encontramos una pequeña proporción de lesiones que son lentamente expansivas que también tienen PRL, pero por lo tanto nosotros pensamos que tal vez estas lesiones hay un overlap entre lesiones que tienen PRL y lesiones que tienen cells. Va a hablar un poco sobre qué es lo que debemos hacer para reparación del tejido. Esto es una publicación que les recomiendo que lean, es un update de una revisión que hicimos que está publicada en Lancet Neurology hace muy poco. Y básicamente, ¿cómo vamos a medir la reparación? Principalmente por los efectos de mielina. El que más se ha utilizado es la transferencia de magnetización y como ustedes pueden ver, uno se imagina que tiene una lesión prelesional, tiene un evento agudo donde disminuye la cantidad de mielina y después poslesión uno tal vez puede influir qué tanto una lesión recupera transferencia de magnetización. Eso ya se utilizó en estudios clínicos controlados de este medicamento Baxerotene, que es actúa sobre el receptor de retinoide, y es un estudio que fue negativo, pero interesantemente en los pacientes que tenían MTR bajo en el corte había un efecto de interacción. Es decir, que en las lesiones que tenían MTR bajo, el medicamento realmente sí funcionaba. Por lo tanto, tal vez lo podemos utilizar. La difusión también se puede utilizar para mielinización, específicamente porque creemos que la conductancia de agua fuera del axón va a indicar que es una lesión desmielinizada. Y también una cosa que se llama myelin water fraction. Esto es básicamente medimos la cantidad de agua que está dentro de la mielina versus la cantidad de agua que está extracelular. Y uno puede hacer una relación entre la cantidad de mielina de agua dentro de la mielina versus la cantidad de agua dentro de la mielina y también intraextracelular, y deriva más o menos lo que es la presencia de esta mielina. Entonces, este es un estudio de Corey Lawley donde claramente se demuestra una relación muy importante entre la presencia de este myelin water fraction y la presencia de mielina en patología. Por último, la resonancia es una herramienta útil para el diagnóstico, pronóstico y tratamiento. Creemos que la atrofia cerebral y también los cambios asociados de volumen son predictores de la progresión, específicamente de la discapacidad. Las lesiones crónicas activas son importantes y creemos que estas son lesiones que se pueden visualizar de dos maneras, con lesiones que se expanden lentamente o con los anillos paramagnéticos, y al finalizar la resonancia también nos puede dar utilidad para reparar la mielina a través de estas imágenes de resonancia que son sensibles a la mielina. Muchos de estos no están listos para la práctica clínica, pero eventualmente lo serán. Muchísimas gracias y con esto termino.
Thank you very much to Jean Carlock for your invitation and for your kind introduction and to the members of the organizing committee. Once again, I would like to thank you for allowing me to return to this beautiful city, and Professor Cumby, I would like to attend. Thank you very much for your molecular and cellular interventions that increase recovery. This is like a sketch, just talking about the principles of achieving this strategy. And also looking at the goals. What are the precursor cells of oligodendrocytes? Demyelination quotient migration and OPCSY blockers, oligodendrocyte precursor cells, astrocleosis microglia and those that prevent their migration, oligodendrocyte precursor cells and microglia desmyelination, as well as changes in the hostile immune inflammatory environment. And we're going to show two cases, apixabanumab and clemastine, and then we're gonna finish. I had already shown you this slide. As Jean Carlos has told us, we need to intervene in all the agents that affect the immune system in this therapeutic area. Structural integrity or damage caused by this immune system, which increases the function of recovery. So here, unfortunately, we don't have these points available yet, so myelination is very important. As you know, axons are exposed and susceptible to the magnitude of the mediator's harmful actions, and it is also of the utmost importance. Remyelinize these axons because if they don't eventually die, there's no way they can recover. Therefore, neurobiology has shown us how oligodendrocytes and precursor cells differentiate into oligodendrocytes, and this is related by deploying different targets that are both activators and inhibitors. As shown on the right and top, we can see what happens to these lesions, where they need to be, oligodendrocyte precursor cells. They become resident or reduced oligodendrocytes, which show us the signal that this is so that these guide cells can be myelinated. Another very important point is that without refactoring, it is presented in. Therefore, maintaining the immune process is a fundamental need because otherwise the newly degenerated axons must act on the immune. Here on the right hand, we can see a sample of targets that have been clinically identified as a target that can be modulated. We have established the ability to differentiate them into fully remyelinated oligodendrocytes. I think it's a very interesting approach. This is based on animal studies that show that organisms with oligodendrocytes fail to respond to differentiation signals. OPCSO is an oligodendrocyte precursor cell. They acquire many points of cell maturity or age. In addition, for example, metformin mimics are rejuvenated due to poor remyelinization and aging. Metformin shows us age-related changes. In reverse, OPCs can respond to different differentiation factors. As we all know, metformin is a drug for anti-diabetic patients, and its safety profile has been established. so it is only representative of the market. Of those currently used for re-engineering, a number of tests are already being carried out to maximize the test. For example, on the left-hand side, we can see the design of the trial and the main results. With secondary SMS, MRI, all these measurements that we can see and capture what we can really use as clinical and imaging tools to evaluate. Potential effects of remyelination? Well, I've been talking to you again about these effects and how we need to investigate what they are perfectly potential and how we can do a complete analysis and search for these molecules. For example, as you remember, this is an important trial developed on these pillars. If the effects of these potentially interesting drugs are examined and carried out, then basically 2030. Potentially interesting compounds available that can be studied for remyelinization. Now I'd like to briefly talk about, say, the early theories and attempts. If you study these points, you can develop these points to remyelinate these points in opicellimab. These specific membranes associated with proteins that hinder remyelination, approaches and models of myelitis encephalopathy of the right hand. We can see that the severity is very important for modeling, and it has been reduced with these antibodies. But you can also see here on the left, this anti-LINGO treatment promotes remelting and repair in this experimental multiple sclerosis model. These preclinical data led to the development of the first clinical development program for the treatment of acute optic neuritis with Opis-Synhab remelting strategy. And the synergy study in a targeted population of recurrent patients. The Infinity study. Now I don't want to go into too many details. The executive summary has interesting clues to the remyelinating effect of Opis synovus. These are the main unfulfilled outcomes. Now, in a randomized controlled study or PAS, Zynovat has recovered P100 of the delayed incubation period of visual evoked potentials. The SNERGY study was conducted in a placebo-controlled M with multiple component evaluation criteria. In the lower right part of this study, 80% of patients with recurrent and secondary progressive MS were included, all of whom were active in the previous months, whether virgin or treated with disease-modifying therapy, and did not meet the primary and secondary evaluation criteria, but the patients improved. On the left, we see a post-hoc analysis that identifies a subpopulation that has benefited from treatment evaluated by this multi-component evaluation criterion. So now, these are the results and questionnaires are being applied. Now the second very promising result is the first generation of antihistamines, the muscarinic receptor clemastine, which has been used for many years for anti-allergies. This is a job. From Ari Green's group in San Francisco, who used the above-mentioned pathway paradigm to study potential defects. And this is a crossover study. Patients were given climazine as the first treatment or placebo and then change. What you can see here is the special latency. And the orange line shows patients who received placebo for the first 3 months. Delayed P100 remained basically stable, and then if we switched to clemastine, there was a significant recovery in P100. Delayed P100 respond, vice versa if we started with clemastine. We soon saw a positive effect, which lasted until we switched to placebo. Clemastine also improved the clarity of low contrast letters. Now, Professor Ontanera gave us a very good outline. From the possibility of remelting with imaging, He introduced the concept of water in myelin, the water fraction in myelin, which was applied in this study by Green Lab N. Only to repeat, the water fraction decreased in if it was correlated with disability. So what they observed and could see was the 2 time intervals, and the patients were randomized. First, with clemistine, there was an increase, you can see. The color changes in percentage, and the myelin sheath water in the callus with clemistine is reduced. In contrast, if no treatment is applied, there will be no positive effect. This is another very interesting study. The Sydney team, led by Michael Panett, used a very interesting nanocatalytic compound, which is nanocrystalline, acetated and clean gold, and it showed that it improved remelting and stimulated it. Evaluate this approach in patients using visual pathways to see the impact on deficits. This is chronic optic neuropathy. The study was called Visionary MSY. The latest results are presented in At one meeting was a 49-week, phase 2 placebo-controlled study. He was given 3,030 milligrams of gold nanoparticle, and we saw how the contrast letters changed in sharpness. Low contrast, and the secondary was the functional composite scale. Recurrent and progressive QM patients with acute chronic neuropathy were recruited. Unfortunately, not all the population was able to recruit. This is a study that took place during the pandemic. So we didn't get the entire planned population for questioning. What you can see here is that the primary effect, that is, the change in the sharpness of low contrast letters, has a positive impact on this intervention. Similarly, side effects or aggregation showed placebo superiority in this study over placebo, and we also saw periclinic evidence. For myelin and axonal integrity, multifocal visual evoked potentials, diffusion tensor imaging and magnetization transfer imaging and in medium. This reflects the integrity of the myelin, and as you can see, compared with placebo, gold nanoparticles have a positive effect. And if they see fractional anisotropy, that is, axonal integrity, this is a positive effect in several brain regions they treat. Gold nanocrystals, so we need to see if it's possible to develop this further into phase 3. I'm not sure how to develop a brief discussion of the modulator of the S1PR receptor, at least preclinically proven. The properties of repair promoters are mainly mediated by S1PR. Together with the Paris group, we have seen potential prelionizing activity of siponimor with microglia, as Professor Comic's target, have already emphasized the potential role of microglia. Here we study several models, such as the transgenic MOOCEA. Here is that if PonyMod's version, these 3 myelinated models also increase the number of myelinated axons, and you can also see this from the electron microscope. On the right is a microglia phenotype scan. As you know, they come in different forms, and the simplistic version is that there is a pro-inflammatory phenotype M1 and 2 phenotypes, anti-inflammatory, and there are molecules that identify them. And on the right, you can see, for example, TMF as a marker in 1 and 1 phenotypes. It was less exposed to NAMAD EAE, the microglia phenotype. Homeostatic phenotypes and living molecules are identified, and the results are consistent. Now I'm not going to talk about this again. This is a very important study. It's a progenitor cell study. On the left you can see these cells are defective, heterologous transplanted, and differentiated into various glial cell populations. So this is a very good example of translating preclinical knowledge into application. In this phase 1 open study called CEO as a small group, It was a pilot study, 12 patients with progressive MS, and as Giancarlo has already said, the primary results. Security was good. There were no problems there. And something very interesting is that there was an effect in terms of brain volume loss, which decreased, and interestingly, it decreased relative to the number of intrathecal neural precursor cells. So there was a higher CSF level and neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory molecules. So this will guide us to further examine the role of progenitor cells in different versions, so to speak, in a repairing approach. And finally, taking back what the professor said with why we must change. The adverse inflammatory microenvironment overcomes the effect of remyelinization. Now I'm not going to go into detail. We all know the key role of B cells in the peripheral, especially in the central nervous system. And how do they interact with microglia and T cells? This is critical to promoting the progressive chronic phase of multiple sclerosis. And so remyelination has a subtle effect and protects the axons. It is important to have a sustained immune response. Well, we've already talked about microglia and different phenotypes, so we need to create a less gun-free immune microenvironment. It also means pushing microglia toward homeostatic, anti-inflammatory phenotypes. This was an experimental work with a Nemoto guy that I already showed you. Giancarlo has also shown the key role of microglia. Will there be a next study to promote remelting and purifying myelin remnants in various ways and allow them to migrate to molecular networks and, of course, BTK inhibitors? And they were effective. This is a study by the Paris group. Then we obtained organotypic brain cultures, and when compared left and right, this immunofluorescence study showed that the BTK individuals restored the ordered structure of the ganglion. Well, so maybe BTK inhibitors could be used as a means to promote remyelinization. Finally, among the many advances, I would like to briefly introduce the Phase 2 study of oxygen RERAP. Doptepan-Vase is a selective estrogen modulator. It protects bone mineral density, and EMA has been tested for postmenopausal use. In this study, the primary outcome was the secondary outcome was low contrast visual acuity in OCPR ion water fraction and RNFLY. Based on the knowledge accumulated over a decade and the role of thyroid hormones in promoting remyelinization, this Phase 1b open-label study of leothyroxine has been conceived and has begun in individuals with multiple sclerosis, and we hope that this drug so sure will give us evidence. A reparation for motion activity. So let me jump to my conclusions. There are a range of potentially effective interventions, both exogenous and endogenous, that have been explored or are currently being explored. We still need to identify appropriate results of clinical studies, whether clinical, imaging, MRI, PET, evoked potential coheromorphography, and access to demyelinating lesions are important and we must be aware of. There is a critical window of opportunity. When the interventions work, we're out of that window. Axons are doomed to die whatever we do. As I mentioned, we need to have a continuous inflammation cancellation. And with this, I want to remind you of the next one. Thank you to my colleagues at the SB meeting, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Comey. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me. These are my conflicts of interest. They really don't relate to this introduction and idea. It is that EM lesions are associated with brain tissue responses, but also behavioral responses. We know that in tissue, after a focal injury, they immediately think of a stroke. There is a tendency to repair plasticity. As we know, there's a larger spinal formation around the lesion. And things are more complicated in the M because not all lesions are detected and not all of them have symptoms, because some only affect the myelin, as Professor Harten said. So we need to detect demyelination early. One of these methods may be evoked potentials, as Professor Horton said, and the one that explores motor pathways is TMS, which is transmagnetic stimulation, and The lower strokes are from peripheral stimulation, and the upper strokes are from cochlear stimulation recorded in the hand muscles. And on the right, you can see the response to cochlear regulation is much smaller and delayed. This can happen without symptoms. Most of the time, symptoms do not appear when there is only one delay without a reduction in amplitude, but even with delays, we can predict that there will be disabilities in about 2 years. We can predict it in 80% with 80% accuracy. So in order to fall into the window of opportunity, we can also apply these tests regularly to detect spinal cortical lesions and try to react. Reaction before axonal loss occurs, and one reaction may be rehabilitation. And I'm talking about preconditioning because we can promote brain plasticity before axonal loss when we're in remelting or even before. Rehabilitation results in brain plasticity, which can be well measured by atrophy measurements such as Professor Ontaneda showed us today that we know that exercise can also have a neuroprotective effect, so it may have a specific effect on the brain. But speaking of the window of opportunity, we may also waste time in clinical studies dealing with the effects of exercise because most studies are meta-analyses of the Ulrich group. He is a great promoter of exercise as a disease-modifying treatment, and he has seen most studies begin in people 5 years after their illness. Maybe we missed part of that window of opportunity by not starting to eject. Exercise early and promote better action preservation. And in other disciplines, they do it. They exercise early. Before the engine deficit occurs at NASA, before sending astronauts into space, they train them for a couple of years to build muscle in these places where they know there's going to be a loss to prevent partner abnormalities, but they do it 2 years before the damage occurs. So we also have the concept of preoperative surgery, which is now widely used before major surgery, orthopedic abdominal cancer, and in 2018 I started doing PubMed to try to find out about Amy. I didn't find anything in many articles. They're accumulating in surgeries. Maybe it's time for us to do something about it, because we know that people should not wait for their locomotives to be affected, even under EDSC. 4. When we see the limitations of walking, we can see that if we do motor tests, the resistance, it has been greatly reduced beyond EDSS 1.5, although it is still below 3. So this is also reflected in more severe fatigue and balance damage. I think it's too late to wait for the disability to become apparent, which is why we have a pre-qualification for the title. But how can we attack small deficits before they are clinical? We will already do cuticle measurements, such as evoked potentials, but we can also use sensors that are used in the body, which can measure gait and are very useful for quantifying various aspects of gait and simple tasks. Dual tasks are also affected in people with MS. And also to measure the effect of rehabilitation, to demonstrate an improvement. On the left, you can see the difference between healthy people and the right, and you can see the effect of rehabilitation. But there is also the possibility of defining the quality of the accordion. In different situations, when you take off your shoes and walk in socks, your gait is much worse. Of course, there are people with progressive MS, but the change is quite significant. There's a big deterioration compared to healthy people who don't care so much. And this makes me think that maybe that we don't have enough gait tests to see what happens to people in real life with the right shoes we wear in the lab. Maybe we should follow up on it at home in your daily activities, because it's not just the kind of equipment that people have in the lab. It's much more sophisticated, including the shoes that patients wear. But also boarding. The patient's attitude is different in the laboratory that is his attitude at home, for example. We already know the doctor is watching us. We're doing our best. And this is written as the Hawthorne effect, which was described by a social scientist when he was at a factory to measure the effect of lighting on workers' production. And they found that when they went there and the light increased, they did better, But when they went there and turned the light down a little bit, they did better. And they just got better because they saw them measuring and trying to do their best. This can happen to healthy people even when walking speed is measured. And if they use wearable sensors, it can also happen to people with EM. Even healthy people walk much faster when they're in the lab than when they're home. So the drop in speed that they can see is what happens when people are home. In addition, people with EM tend to walk less and spend more time in bed, as you can see below left with EM. This is more evident with, although the EDSS is less than 5, you can see that the increase in EDSS is more resting or sitting longer. So we have to do something to promote physical activity, of course, in the early stages of the disease.
The number of these points in 2 years, and then we have to observe these definitions because of the number of these points, we have to understand them. But I have to say that even measuring this number includes various factors, which is very important because although this does not prevent these factors from worsening in the future, it is very important for people who have received this software to be able to monitor these studies and this point that there is a decline. We see that patients have to start with this on the left hand, and they have to see it worsen later because this does not happen in patients who do not undergo lockdown. Even the number of patients may be at higher risk of regeneration. Then we have to reduce the measures and use other, more sophisticated measures. For example, the speed of different points is very important, and it is also necessary to provide sensors to measure qualitative points. Then not only. So we used a lot of sensors to perform these tests, and they had to be more sophisticated because they provided measures of walking quality and understood that more than 600 people with multiple sclerosis had this type of pain. We saw, how can I tell you if we can improve this progression reduction by using more measures? But we have taken many measures to find that these initial damage points may have these potentials or reduce walking ability, and we have many tools to counteract them. Inactivity or promoting physical activity, and we had indications. We can use the technology that was promoted during COVID for people who are having this type of problem, but we can also use it for people who don't have this yet. One example is that people don't. Can you have this? Did they also use this rehabilitation point? As in the results, we've already had meta-analysis to see balance, neurological inactivity, and it could be important. So we're closing this point, and remotely we can use these important points. This is a way to start early in people who are not disabled. And well, an example that has already been proven by me. He said they also use these commercial rehabilitation devices to provide them to people who are not yet incapacitated to carry out such training with good results or walking measures, but also after. We can improve other symptoms, and we have made a point in Germany about fatigue with these therapies. And recently, last year, we were able to see the positive results of these intervention points with this level of treatment for people with regression. Multiple sclerosis compared to. But if we don't want to use technology, then we can see that there is an important point in improving the specificity of people with multiple sclerosis, balance, walking, and exercise. This is something we really want to use. It's the guy, for example, the shoe guy. And other tools, so it's worth treating us, and another possibility to train and strengthen these points for the devices we want to perform. So, also talk about exercise and these projects, and compare the fact that we have this rehabilitation alone. We have this COVID-related rehabilitation exercise. Unfortunately, the study was negative and there was no difference between the 4 groups. But this is even because the control shows us that it is improving the physical function and cognitive field. We also see that this is a controlled form, a controlled condition. For example, doing these research related to these points. So another way to improve this is what we need to be able to promote spectacle in order to increase brain space. We know that we use them in the motor cortex to see the results and representation of the motor cortex approach. We can also improve these representations by not only inhibiting them, but also reducing the hemisphere involved in focal lesions. This could be that we promote, even if we combine this brain information has been used, for example, in cognitive rehabilitation, fatigue, and it has been shown that in addition to using this, we have a good point in using this rehabilitation. We have successful data from our colleagues at Chappie in New York who combine this with cognitive rehabilitation at our institute. We have a very successful point, and combined with this kind of rehabilitation that is improving. In the countryside, even after this discharge, the dotted line after the patient was discharged shows us that all of this exists, while the other patients had these physical activities with this neuromagnetic stimulation after 15 weeks. So after 13 weeks of high, they returned to their original state. It's a way to improve the duration of recovery. Even patients with axoma can use OCT less likely, but I think in the future we can choose patients to have this kind of virtual neuromodulation, virtual reality, or robotics. So we can stop waiting for the patient to have rehab. How can we choose? Well, it's with the same list of tools that the doctor has already shown us a way to measure this OCT. Action points, all of which I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
I'll talk about this in my previous lecture on course classification. In this talk, I will now focus on diagnostic criteria, which are actually one of the most important points we need to see. Today, I'm going to talk about history, diagnostic criteria, and then I'm going to have time to be able to talk. What is the historical evolution of diagnostic criteria? I think that in 1965, when Konk-Maher introduced the concept of space-time propagation, this concept is now being modified to decreased in some forms, such as clinical disease spread over time and space. Possession then first introduced the use of additional clinical or laboratory evidence, which was not available at the time to prove. Spatial and temporal diffusion, so magnetic resonance is evidence of spatial and temporal diffusion, and then in these editions, in 2005 and 2010, magnetic resonance was used to prove this spatial diffusion. And we saw that they were very important points, and the first thing we have to remember is these brainstem and spine. Another really important point is what was given in the 2017 edition of McDonald's criteria. This is where the integration of history and imagery and temporal dissemination must see how everything falls within the scope of possible diseases. Laboratory evidence in terms of diagnostics and neurologist experience, as well as these criteria, must be interpreted in order to be able to try to advocate. These points and exceptions must be considered on a case-by-case basis. In this review and the 2017 diagnostic criteria, McDonald said there were some very important changes. The first is a very important difference because for the first time, the concept of the the temporal spread of these new lesions in space in the second moment to consolidate the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis is like a fragmentation, because there is evidence that a new point may be replaced by the presence of immunoglobulins in the disease. So the idea here, if you have evidence of immunoglobulins in a continuous process, in a way it can't be done at these points, so this also has to be discussed a lot, but in many cases. The second is, for example, both for evidence of spatial propagation. Both lesions due to MRI attacks, whether asymptomatic or asymptomatic, can be used, and finally the vision of cortical to juxtapocortical lesions. Therefore, after the new version of the standard in 2017, some publications were published. This study, for example, shows the importance of this study because it examines the possibility of damage. This is at the time of the attack. But many of the studies used to validate the criteria looked at evolution after the first attack, some even at the age of 4 or 5. Here are the differences. With regard to the question of how many patients with this new criterion can be diagnosed immediately according to these new versions of the diagnostic criterion, the change is related to a very strong increase from 17% to 72%. This is particularly true because spinal discrimination replaces evidence of these lesions caused by MRI. Where are we at the moment? Well, at the end of last year, we met in Barcelona, Spain. In order to try to use this diagnostic criterion, the concept continues, the results will be presented and then published, and this is the group of people we see involved in this development of this new criterion under the point of such van. This method is also different from the method we showed in the previous versions in 2010 and 2017 and is made by agreement. Be aware that this criterion is considered approved. Therefore, the analysis is quite intensive and extensive, and it is prepared by a large group of meetings. For example, here you can see the different points discussed. They won't let me decide what's going to happen, but because it's still going on, but I'm going to try to summarize some of the points so that I can provide them. Some comments on this issue clearly consider the importance of being able to revise McDonald's 2017 standards, which is almost unanimous in this case. Some considerations I particularly like because it's almost new compared to 2017. These MOGAD-POMS diseases have been diagnosed in MOGAD patients, but these black holes may also improve the accuracy of the diagnosis of POMS and the presentation of the spine and bone marrow, as you can see in the reports, even with this presentation MOGAD sees. We can do this to exclude MOGAD in a way that is very important, especially for these presentations, and we can see that many of the patients who were previously classified as these acute points need to be treated in a subsequent way. In the vast majority of MOGAD cases, so this is a very important point to be able to highlight them, so we finally think we have to see this introduced by Daniel Contamira and these injuries that may also be seen in pediatric cases. However, this is not relevant enough to allow these criteria. Another very important point is the role of comorbidities and the role of aging, because they must interact with a particular differential diagnosis. With these presentations, which may be quite different from the presentations of the past 30 years, another very important point that has been made is that it is particularly important to try to anticipate the diagnosis now in patients who need to be isolated at these points. Therefore, this is the key to considering the potential overlap of these points with recombination and differential diagnosis. So we're trying to use this kind of negative MRI parameter that Daniel talked about. Another really important point is the dogma that we need to solve over time. This is something that has been challenged in 2017 by replacing temporal diffusion with evidence of anomalous synthesis. But, well, the discussion here was that it was a little deeper, because if we see the result From the points here, more than 85% of patients were included in these points with a 2-year follow-up, and these patients were found to be satisfied with the evidence of temporal transmission, and most of these studies, they were associated with these benefits, which were about 90% of patients had evidence of this temporal transmission, and even after 2 years, which meant that these patients who entered the study were classified as CIS is at very high risk, and this may be related to the temporal spread that is later confirmed in the vast majority of cases. Therefore, this radiologically isolated syndrome is a diagnostic criterion, and I can only predict it because these are evidence predictive points that combine these risk factors can emerge by predicting 90% of conversions over 10 years with 4 or more of these negative and proportional points. This approach, which is obviously possible even at these critical points, can be a very important development, so it can move from clinical to biological diagnosis. Is this the next point after acknowledging these? Of course, this point is also very important when we consider the diagnostic criteria used. Everyone, even she, is very clear about not risking this diagnosis, and another really fundamental point is to discuss these rules and not tell us whether it's strange that the optic nerve must have. This presentation that wasn't included in these diagnostic criteria before is one of the sites where the problem is that when we discussed in 2017 the possibility, which was a very, very long discussion, it was then that she was in charge of proposing the use of the optic nerve. So we can see this spatial diffusion, and we don't disagree that this is a good idea. Therefore, the evidence comes from subclinical neuroticism by MRI, so that this type of involvement can be seen in a common way in this system. For example, here we have new studies of asymptomatic optic nerve involvement, and now we have these different tools to reveal this subclinical optic nerve involvement to take into account this difference. And well, this new MRI and these recovery techniques show us exactly better optic nerve damage. And in the evidence of M4, some of the well done, they have to do with these points in 2009, and we are very clear that in fact it is not even a common point, but it is possible. What do we really need to see these injuries? Point to point. This also shows us that the use of this can increase this sensitivity without compromising. And we see that the exclusion of the use of these points is related to the use of these data to be able to demonstrate. This involvement of the optic nerve can also be revealed by this optical tomography, but we have to have this advantage from this symmetry with these cells and this evaluation. So these data are very interesting. Some studies, as we have shown in the proportion of patients with the time of optic nerve subdentate and first aphasia without optic nerve involvement is not marginal. So optic nerve involvement combined with this has been shown to increase sensitivity without compromise. Specific, and I think it will be a very good decision, and here are some of the studies that support this. Well, I'm going to be very brief here because it's already been discussed and perfectly shown by Dr. Antonetta. I don't need to walk too much. These are the key points, reminding them that enlarged lesions are valuable because they tend to be almost specific to multiple sclerosis. So instead of just counting the injuries and looking at the distribution, here we pay attention to the physical details of the injuries. So this is another way to help reduce the risk of false definitions from EM when multiple sclerosis does not exist. I think this consensus statement is very important to provide a point of view. The central vein sign has been the first of 3 specific or near-specific parameters to characterize lesions as lesions. DM, the sign of the central vein is the first. Attempt to go in this direction. Of course, there are some features that must be used to evaluate the signs of the central vein, and this type of analysis is now available on most MRI machines, so it's already starting to be used in our clinical practice. And I think it's a very important sign because a lot of studies have shown that this sign, it has a very good type of specificity and sensitivity. Of course, it is important to consider where the threshold is. And of course, the threshold can be an absolute number. Here are the proposed numbers, which are 3 and 6, or it can be a percentage. There are both positive and negative aspects of the election, but in any case, at least the initial assessment here He led us to use this as a diagnostic criterion to be very specific and pay more attention to specificity. So this is the direction. Wherever everything goes well, number 6 seems to be more appropriate from this point of view. You've heard about this paramagnetic technique that I'm not going to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about injuries either. Let them expand. What better? What's going on in the M era? In recent years, the use of body fluid biomarkers has increased significantly. In the past, we knew it was very unavailable. Oligoclonal bands have long been the only relevant tool, and now we have very interesting tools. Of course, neurofilaments are a very important possible tool, and cerebrospinal fluid light chains are also a very good possibility. This is used in trials where there is a very strong anti-inflammatory reaction. So the reaction is, inside the central nervous system, we would hope to have more of these free light chains for antibody construction. And of course, if we measure these changes in CSF and compare them with the changes in blood by correcting them for the algorithm, we'll see something similar. What we used to do with the index, IGY, a recent study, has documented that this tool has a great advantage in giving numbers. Giving a number is an objective assessment, and we know that for oligoconic bands, it's sometimes not so easy to define the exact number. Recent studies have confirmed the importance and potentially important role of these free layer-like light chains, and it seems that they are less useful in differential diagnosis. In other neurological diseases, the sensitivity of this band seems to be quite good and very similar, which we might have with the evaluation of oligoconic bands. The good thing is that they don't overlap completely. Some patients may have positive oligoconic bands and free light chains, negative layers, and vice versa. This proportion is small, really small. It can still be helpful in some specific cases, so it is very important to try. Consider this measurement. Well, I'm about to conclude my speech, and these are the proposed revisions, and in a few months you'll hear. What was decided? I could only anticipate them. Will there be a definite moment in the possibility of diagnosis? As I said, I will not go into the second topic I should cover. I only have 4 slides. I think we have already discussed the definition of multiple sclerosis in different ways at this symposium. In particular, try to see if we should rethink the causes. And this was produced by the DM Alliance to question a panel of experts about the opportunity to change the current classification of primary, secondary, progressive, and recurring submissions. On the one hand, it is considered and still possible to have a separation between. And this is also based on the answers to the questionnaire, how can they see? There was some intensity and frequency on the importance of revising the classification. Here you can also see the attitude towards the current clinical course descriptors and some of the key questions we see here. There was a very divided view of what we should continue to use the concepts of active and inactive in course classification, and also the important role of magnetic resonance imaging. From this opposite point of view, it is quite obvious that most people agree to maintain the division between primary and secondary school progression. And the second line is that there is this prevailing view that M is just a course of a disease. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to ask all the rapporteurs in this section to come to the stage in just 5 minutes, because it is very late.